they're all Labour Party members now, by the sounds of it, based on that budget.
Well, you'd hope so, because the government just won an 80-seat majority with a promise to rebuild the Red Wall. But there were a lot of problems in this budget. We were promised 600 billion in investment for the Red Wall communities. By my reckoning, this doesn't even add up to 100 billion. There were some good measures on business rates and a bit on broadband, but it's nothing like the scale of investment that's been promised.
What's missing from your perspective?
Well, there's very little detail actually about what they're actually going to spend any of this money on, and I suspect that's because of the one word that the Chancellor didn't say, which is Brexit, which he barely mentioned at all during the speech. This morning Michael Gove went to the Select Committee and said that the government isn't going to publish their proposed impact assessment about the trade deal that they're seeking with the EU. I suspect that the reason there's very little detail about investment into the Red Wall communities in this budget is because the government quite simply doesn't know what sort of economic state the country's going to be in a few months' time. So they just don't know if they're actually going to be able to keep the promise that they made a few months ago.
So the headline figure was there, the headline commitment was there. You want more detail?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, by my reckoning, the amount of money that is being pledged adds up to about 63 billion rather than 600 billion, so that's pretty short. There are bigger problems as well. I mean, the Chancellor said that he was going to give the NHS the resources that it needs to deal with coronavirus, which is very welcome, but there was a great big gaping hole in what he said, and that's social care. Now, Red Wall communities are older communities. They're places where jobs have been lost and young people have had to leave, and so you've got a lot of older people in those areas. They're the ones that are most at risk of coronavirus. And
would you include your own constituency in that?
Absolutely. Wigan is one of the oldest places in Greater Manchester, and without funding for social care, a lot of those older people will be either very, very isolated because their children and grandchildren live hundreds of miles away from them, or they'll be in hospitals seeking care there. You're
certain that the announcement on the NHS in relation to corona in particular does not extend to social care, because they dovetail in a big way, don't they, in reality?
I mean, they absolutely do. If you don't fund social care, then you have a crisis in the National Health Service. But it was concerning that he didn't mention social care, because actually social care is extremely cash short at the moment. And so even just to get it to a place where we've got the amount of care that we need without coronavirus takes an enormous injection of cash. He just didn't mention it.
But are you swayed by the argument that actually that's Matt Hancock's gig? He'll talk about that.
Well, it's the Chancellor's gig, because this was billed as a...
But in the shorter term, I mean, about coronavirus.
I mean, I very much hope that when they look again at this, they will realise that if they don't fund social care, then we're going to have a real problem, because old people, if they can't get help at home, will go to hospital, and if they go to hospital, then we've got an even bigger public health crisis. And so social care is a really big issue in the Red Wall communities without coronavirus, because it's the thing that is really eating into councils' budgets, and unless they put a big injection of cash into councils, they won't be able to fund anything else in those areas.
You presumably support the kind of measures I was just outlining before you joined us. Statutory sick pay, well, I was reporting on the budget outlining them. Statutory sick pay for all of those who are advised to self-isolate, even if they're not displaying symptoms. Hardship fund of 500 million to local authorities. The government meeting the costs for small businesses of fewer than 250 employees for providing statutory sick pay. You presumably support those measures?
Very much so. I think it's extremely important and right that the government is coming forward with measures to actually protect people so that they can take time off if they feel ill. There is a bigger problem, though, which is that many of those people who work in insecure employment, particularly agency workers. I'm thinking of people like social care workers in my constituency who work for agencies because they've been outsourced, cleaners, gig economy workers, Uber drivers, courier delivery drivers. We know that they've been under enormous pressure not to take time off. Often that's because of the business model. So social care providers work to very small margins. They put staff under huge amounts of pressure to turn up, or they don't get paid. But he seemed to be
saying, and you tell me if I've missed something here, he seemed to be saying that those kinds of workers will have more ready access and early access to benefits if they have to self-isolate.
He did suggest that, and obviously the devil will be in the detail, but it's very welcome. But there's a bigger problem too, which is if their company puts them under pressure to turn up for work, then they will be more likely to turn up for work, and in social care in particular that will be a public health disaster. So we've got to make sure that there is actually protection for employees, that they aren't subject to disciplinary action or fired because they say that they have to self-isolate. And that's one of the reasons why I said yesterday that the government should set up a workers' commission to make sure that companies that are putting employees under undue pressure to turn up for work should be fined, and action should be taken against them, because we've got to make sure that people are protected. Otherwise we could have not just an economic disaster but a public health disaster as well.
And that's unlikely to be set up in time for the next few months that we're facing on coronavirus. But just more broadly on the tone of this budget, do you think as left-wing a budget as this, if I can be sort of lazy in my terminology, would have been possible had Jeremy Corbyn not been the leader of the Labour Party for the last few years?
I mean, I think this sounds that the government has moved on in a number of areas. They were very keen, for example, to talk about the carbon capture and storage project that they're setting up, which is extremely welcome. £800 million. It's supposed to create 6,000 jobs. But there's a problem here, because David Cameron actually proposed something similar, and he was going to put up £1 billion for it, so more money. It went on for 4 years. They had companies bidding for it, and in 2015, just before they were due to award this project, they cancelled it at enormous cost to all of the companies that had spent 4 years investing in research and development to win the contract. So I'm not convinced at all that this will actually happen, or that the government will be able to convince companies to come forward. And at the same time as talking about these huge green projects that they're creating outside of London in the southeast, they're actually putting money into roads, potholes and freezing fuel duty for the 10th year in a row. Car usage is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions for the first time as of last year. They should be investing in buses and trains, and yet there was virtually no talk about trains and no talk at all about buses. That's a real problem in those communities that they've just won for the first time, because most people are on buses, and that is what people need investment in.
All important stuff, but doesn't it fit? It's an odd time at the moment, isn't it, with coronavirus hanging over all of us? The here and now, and the staying safe, and the keeping our vulnerable relatives alive from coronavirus. Clearly, some of the stuff you've touched on, is connected to it. But are you confident that the approach the government is taking on coronavirus more generally is the right one? Because it is very pointedly taking a sort of baby steps approach to change rather than wholesale change, such as we've seen in Italy. Are you confident that that's the right thing?
I think it's enormously welcome that the government has allowed the experts back after Michael Gove famously said they were getting rid of them. The chief medical advisor, chief scientific advisor, I think have been extremely convincing during this, and I think that politicians should be following medical and scientific advice. The chief medical officer said, for example, that they didn't think there was much merit in cancelling big outdoor events, because they think that it is more likely then that people will go into smaller venues like pubs and watch big sporting events there, where they're more likely to come into contact with one another. I think that's the sort of advice that we ought to be listening to, not panicking unduly, but following the advice, and as and when it develops, continuing to do that.